Not yet, please don't go.
I have to.
Please stay.
On day 29, the most feared man in Seoul stood in the rain outside her apartment door. No bodyguards. No gun. No armor. Just him, soaking wet, chest heaving, fist raised and trembling against her door. And when she opened it, the man who had never begged for anything in his entire life looked at her with eyes that had clearly been crying and said 5 words that broke both of them completely.
Please don't go, not yet.
I have to.
Not like this.
But here's what you need to understand. 29 days earlier, this woman had walked into his life for one reason and one reason only: money. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care. And she had absolutely, positively, 100% no intention of falling in love with him. So how did they get here? How did a Ghanaian woman with a sharp mouth, zero filter, and a collection of unpaid rent notices end up being the one thing a Korean Mafia boss couldn't live without? Let me tell you everything. Before we begin, my mum said this video cannot reach 10,000 views and 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. Smash that like button, subscribe right now, and drop in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's get into this story. Abena Asante had what her mother lovingly called a mouth with no brakes and a heart with no reverse gear. She was 26 years old, a freelance translator fluent in 5 languages: English, Chui, French, Mandarin, and Korean. And she was currently 43 days behind on rent in her tiny Seoul apartment, eating instant noodles for the 3rd time that week, and arguing with her landlord through a closed door. Miss Asante, I need the money by Friday or... Mr. Cho, I love you like a distant uncle, but I need you to give me 1 more week or I will begin singing every morning at 6 a.m. and you know I cannot carry a tune. There was a pause. 1 week. Final. Abena pressed her back against the door and exhaled slowly. She needed money. Fast. She'd already sold her spare laptop. She'd already taken every translation gig on every app. She was desperate, which is the only explanation for why, when the sleek black business card slid under her door 20 minutes later with a number and the words temporary position, substantial compensation, discretion required, she picked it up instead of throwing it away. She called the number. A woman with a crisp, professional voice answered immediately. Miss Asante. Thank you for calling. We'd like to offer you a 30-day contract position. You would pose as the personal girlfriend of our employer at select public and private events. Compensation is 50 million Korean won, paid in full on day 30. Confidentiality agreement required. Are you available to meet tomorrow? Abena pulled the phone from her ear and stared at it. 50 million won. That was roughly $37,000. She put the phone back to her ear. What's the catch? No catch. Our employer requires a convincing companion for a specific social season. You were selected based on your language proficiency, your background, and a brief background check. You did a background check on me? Standard procedure. That is creepy, but also, did you see my landlord situation? Because I need that money. A pause. We're aware of your current circumstances. Abena stood up straight. I want 60 million. Silence. Miss Asante. I'm fluent in 5 languages, I can handle any social situation, and clearly your employer needs someone good enough to fool people who are paying attention. 60 million or I go back to my noodles. Another pause. Longer this time. 60 million. Agreed. Be at this address tomorrow at 9 a.m. Abena wrote down the address, hung up, looked around her tiny apartment, and said out loud to no one, we are not falling in love. This is business. In and out. 30 days. She should have known better. She should have known the moment she walked into that building the next morning. All glass and steel and silent men in suits who parted like the Red Sea when she approached, that this was not a normal job. The elevator required a fingerprint scan. The floor she was taken to had no number. And the office she was led into was bigger than her entire apartment building. She stood in the center of that room, clutching her portfolio like a shield, and told herself to be professional. Then the door opened. And in walked Kang Jiseok. He was tall, taller than she expected. Broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved specifically to make women forget their own names. He wore a dark suit with no tie, top button open, and he walked like a man who had never once in his life wondered whether he belonged in a room. Dark eyes swept over her once. Quick, assessing, almost bored. He sat behind his desk without a word, opened a folder and said, without looking up, "You're the translator." Abena blinked. "You're the Mafia boss." His eyes lifted slowly. Something shifted in them, not quite amusement but close. "I prefer businessman. I prefer well compensated." She sat down without being invited. "So, how does this work?" For the first time in what his assistant would later describe as possibly years, Kang Jiseok almost smiled. Almost. He slid a contract across the desk. 30 pages. She flipped to the last one, 60 million won, day 30. She looked up at him. "One question. Do I have to kiss you?" His expression didn't change. "Only if necessary." Define necessary. Convincing people we're in love. Abena capped her pen. Looked him dead in the eye. "For 60 million won, I will make them believe you hung the moon. But let's be clear, this is fake. Completely fake. I don't do feelings and you look like you don't either, so we'll get along just fine." He held her gaze for a long, unreadable moment. "Sign the contract, Miss Asante." She signed it. And that was the single most consequential mistake of both their lives. Day 1 started with an ambush. Abena arrived at Kang Jiseok's penthouse, which, for the record, occupied the entire top floor of a building she later Googled and discovered he owned, in her best business professional outfit, a neat blazer over a deep burgundy wrap dress, gold hoops, edges laid with military precision, and the energy of a woman who had absolutely everything under control. She did not have everything under control. She had been awake since 4 a.m. doing research. Kang Jiseok, 31 years old. Heir to and current leader of the Kang Syndicate, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in East Asia, though the word criminal never appeared anywhere near his name in any publication. Publicly, he was the CEO of Kang Holdings, a conglomerate spanning real estate, logistics, and private security. Forbes had featured him twice. He had been photographed at charity galas. He donated to children's hospitals. He was also, according to 3 carefully worded intelligence reports she found through channels she absolutely would not mention, responsible for the kind of order and fear that made entire city blocks go quiet when his car drove through. She had read all of this and still walked into his penthouse, so clearly she had a problem. His assistant, a sharp-eyed Korean woman named Min who communicated primarily through subtle eyebrow raises, handed her a schedule. Abena looked at it. "This is a 30-day calendar." "Yes." "There are events on every single day." "Yes." "He has me booked for a private dinner tonight. It says," she squinted at the paper, "first date. Establish chemistry." "Correct." Abena looked up. Who writes establish chemistry in a calendar? Mr. Kang is thorough. Mr. Kang is terrifying. Also correct. Jiseok appeared from a hallway wearing a black turtleneck and grey trousers, looking like he'd stepped out of a high-fashion editorial about dangerous men, which she was beginning to understand, was simply what he looked like on a normal Tuesday. He looked at her. "You're on time." "I'm always on time. I'm Ghanaian, not a stereotype." His head tilted slightly. "I didn't say anything about stereotypes." "Your eyebrow did." He blinked. Looked at his own eyebrow as though consulting it. "My eyebrow said nothing." It was very loud. She tucked the schedule under her arm. "So, first date. Where are we going?" Something that was not quite a smile crossed his face again. It was starting to feel like a signature move, this almost smile that he kept like a secret. "Somewhere you'll need better shoes." Abena looked down at her heels. Back up at him. "These shoes have been to 3 countries and 1 near-death experience, and they've never let me down." "We'll see." He was right. She needed different shoes. What she did not expect was for him to have already arranged for an entire selection to be waiting in a guest room. Her size, every style, a quiet acknowledgement that he had planned for her pride and her practicality at once. She stood in front of them for a moment longer than she should have. She chose the most comfortable pair, came back out, and said nothing about it. He said nothing either. But she caught the small, satisfied look he gave Min when he thought Abena wasn't watching, and she filed it away under, "He pays more attention than he pretends to." The restaurant he took her to was on the 42nd floor of a building overlooking the Han River. Private dining, no other guests, floor-to-ceiling windows with Seoul glittering like scattered diamonds below them. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful things Abena had ever seen. She sat down, looked out at the city and said, "Okay. This is excessive. It's practical. A 42-story private restaurant is practical. In public, people photograph me. Photographs complicate things. This is simpler." She looked at him. "Is your whole life like this? Optimized for control?" He picked up his menu. "Yes." "That sounds exhausting." He looked up. "It is." He said it so quietly, so without armor, that it caught her completely off guard. She blinked. He looked back at his menu immediately, like he hadn't said it, like he'd already decided to pretend the moment hadn't happened. But it had happened. Abena looked at her own menu and reminded herself firmly, fake. This is fake. He is handsome and sad and powerful, and this is fake. Dinner was extraordinary. The food was ridiculous. 6 courses, each more beautiful than the last. He was a surprisingly decent conversationalist when she pushed past his walls, which she did with the precision of someone who had been charming information out of difficult people her entire life. She learned that he spoke 4 languages. That he hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. That his favorite food was his late grandmother's jollof. He said it without explanation, and when she whipped around to stare at him, he looked almost defensive. "My grandmother was from Accra," he said simply. The silence stretched between them. "You're part Ghanaian?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "A quarter. My maternal grandmother was Ghanaian Korean. She passed when I was 12. He paused. "It's part of why you were selected for this arrangement. The story would be more credible." "Right," she said. "Credible." She looked out at the river. He looked at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that coincidence this specific rarely felt like coincidence at all. The drive home was quiet and warm. His car was the kind of luxury that felt like being wrapped in something expensive and safe. She watched Seoul pass by the window and told herself she was not charmed. She was professional. This was a job. Then his hand rested on the center console, palm up, not reaching for her, just resting there, loose and open, and she didn't know why, but after a moment she placed her hand in it. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. But neither of them moved until the car stopped. Day 1. 29 to go. She was already in trouble. By day 7, Abena had a system. Wake up. Remind herself it was fake. Show up looking incredible. Survive another day of Kang Jiseok being unexpectedly, inconveniently human. Go home. Stare at the ceiling. Repeat. The system was failing spectacularly. It was failing because of things she hadn't prepared for. Small, ordinary things that had no business being romantic but somehow were. The way he always made sure there was Ghanaian pepper sauce on the table when she came to the penthouse because she'd mentioned once, that she put it on everything. The way he'd told his entire staff to address her as Miss Abena and not by her surname because, when she asked why, he'd simply said, "You work hard to make people comfortable. You shouldn't have to be a stranger in a space you occupy every day." She had gone home that night and had a strongly worded conversation with her own heart. Her heart was not listening. Day 8 was the gala, the real reason for the entire arrangement. Jiseok's primary rival in the business world, a man named Director Choi who wore his corruption like a cologne, was hosting a charity event that every powerful person in Seoul attended. Jiseok needed to appear stable, socially connected, and, most importantly, romantically grounded. Apparently, in these circles, a man without a partner was a man with vulnerabilities. Abena was his armor. She showed up in a dress that had taken her 2 days to find, deep green silk that made her dark skin glow like something lit from within, her hair in an elaborate updo that had cost her 3 hours and was absolutely worth it. She stood in the lobby of Jiseok's building waiting for him to come down. When the elevator opened and he saw her, he stopped walking. Just stopped. A full 3 seconds. She raised an eyebrow. "You're staring." "I'm noticing," he corrected, and resumed walking, but the back of his neck was slightly pink and she committed that to memory for the rest of her life. The gala was extraordinary and awful. Extraordinary because it was the kind of room where history and money and danger moved around each other like predators at a watering hole. Fascinating to watch if you understood the dynamics, which Abena did. Awful because director Choi spent 20 minutes circling them with the specific energy of a man who was looking for cracks. He found none. Because Abena was extraordinary at this. She laughed at exactly the right moments. She touched Jiseok's arm with the casual ease of a woman who'd been doing it for years. She leaned in and whispered something in his ear, actually whispered, "Your rival has spinach in his teeth and karma is real," and watched Jiseok's composure almost shatter in real time as he fought not to laugh in director Choi's face. When Choi finally moved on, Jiseok bent down slightly and murmured against her temple, "That was diabolical." "I know," she whispered back, smiling at a passing couple. "You're welcome." His hand pressed against the small of her back, warm and firm and real, and she felt it in her spine. Fake, she reminded herself. Absolutely fake. Day 11 was not fake. Day 11 happened because of rain. They'd been returning from a late dinner when the sky opened up without warning. His driver was 2 blocks away. They ducked into the narrow overhang of a closed bookshop, pressed together by the smallness of the space, rain sheeting down in front of them. Seoul glittered and roared in the downpour. She was laughing, at nothing, at the rain, at the absurdity of 60 million one fake girlfriend standing soaking wet outside a closed bookshop at midnight. He was looking at her laughing, and something in his face had changed. Gone soft and unguarded in a way she'd never seen before. "What?" she asked, catching his expression. "Nothing." He looked away. "You laugh like it costs you nothing." She considered that. Isn't that how laughing is supposed to work? Not for everyone. She looked at him then, really looked. At the composed, controlled, impenetrable man who had somehow never learned to laugh like it cost him nothing. And she thought about the grandmother from Accra. The 3 years without a vacation. The almost smiles. "Jiseok," she said. First time she'd used his first name without the formal title. He went very still. "When did you last do something just because it felt good? Not because it was strategic or necessary or optimized for something?" A long pause. The rain was very loud. "I don't remember," he said. She reached over and took his hand. "Not for show. Not for the contract. Just because." His fingers curled around hers. They stood like that until the car arrived, not talking, just holding on while Seoul washed itself clean around them. And Abena walked home that night knowing with devastating clarity that she had made a terrible, wonderful mistake. Day 14. Halfway. She was falling. And from the look in his eyes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. So was he. Nobody warned Abena about day 15. Day 15 was when Kang Jiseok, in an apparent lapse of his usual ironclad control, took her to Namdaemun Market at 7 in the morning because she'd mentioned, while half asleep in the back of his car after a late event, that she missed the chaos of Makola Market in Accra, and hadn't been to an open-air market since moving to Seoul. She woke up that morning to a message that said, "Be ready at 6:45. Comfortable shoes." She stared at her phone. Typed back, "Are you smiling right now?" 3 full minutes passed. Then no. She could tell he absolutely was. They walked through Namdaemun with no bodyguards, which she later learned had caused 3 of his security team to have what could be medically classified as a collective breakdown. Just the 2 of them, moving through the early morning rush of vendors and ajumas and the glorious, overwhelming smell of street food frying in the cold air. Abena was in her element. She bargained aggressively in Korean for a pair of earrings that she absolutely did not need, won the negotiation decisively, turned to find Jiseok watching her with pure, undisguised delight. "You just made that woman give you 20% off a 5,001 item," he said. "It's the principal." The principal cost her 1,001. The principal is worth 1,001. She put the earrings on right there at the stall, checked her reflection in a tiny hanging mirror, and looked at him. Good. He looked at her for a moment too long. Yes. She bought him fish cake from a street vendor he tried to tell her he didn't need. She made him eat it while walking, which he did with the careful dignity of a man eating street food for possibly the first time in a decade. She watched him close his eyes when the flavor hit and said, "That face. That is a man who needed fish cake." "I didn't need fish cake." "Your face needed fish cake." He looked at her sideways. And then, finally, fully, completely, he smiled. Not the almost smile. Not the controlled half-curve. A real one. Open and warm and startled by itself, like it had escaped before he could catch it. Abena felt it hit her chest like a physical thing. She looked away before he could see her reaction and bought herself hotiak and said absolutely nothing, but she was smiling too and she couldn't stop. Days 16 through 20 were a montage of things that had no business being on any professional contract. Cooking dinner together in his penthouse kitchen at midnight after a cancelled reservation. She made red, he stood close and handed her things without being asked, learning her rhythms, and when they ate it at the kitchen counter at 1 a.m. he said it was the best thing he'd eaten in years and she believed him. A late-night drive to the Han River where they sat on the hood of his car and she told him about Accra, about her mother's fabric shop, about the way every neighborhood smelled different, about the particular quality of light at 6 in the evening when everyone came home. He listened with his whole body. Asked questions. Remembered details. He told her about his grandmother. Really told her about the summers he'd spent half in Seoul, half in Accra, how he'd been a different person there later. How something had closed in him when she passed. How he hadn't spoken Chui since he was 12 years old. "Say something," Abena said softly. "In Chui." A long pause. Then very quietly, in an accent shaped by childhood and grief and 20 years of silence, "Waho ti sun." "How are you?" She pressed her lips together. Looked at the river. "Me ho ye," she whispered back. "I'm fine." He nodded once. Said nothing. But his shoulder was warm against hers and neither of them moved apart. The kiss happened on day 22. Not for the contract. Not for an audience. They were in the penthouse after a long quiet evening, and she had been standing at the window watching the city when she heard him come up behind her, and when she turned he was close, closer than necessary, and he said nothing, just looked at her with that dark, steady, undone gaze, and she thought fake one final time, and then she stopped thinking entirely. It was slow. It was devastating. His hands cradled her face like she was something rare, and she grabbed his lapels and kissed him back like she'd been waiting 22 days, because she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing too hard, his forehead dropped to hers. "This isn't in the contract," she managed. "No," he agreed, and kissed her again. By day 25, she was waking up in his penthouse and learning that Kang Jiseok, the most feared man in Seoul, made extraordinarily good coffee and had a secret shelf of Ghanaian novels. Bought, she suspected, sometime in the last 2 weeks, and that he held her like she was both precious and permanent. She was happy. Terrifyingly, dangerously, completely happy. Which is exactly when things went wrong. Day 26 arrived wearing the face of a woman named Ji Hyun. Abena was in the lobby of Kong Holdings, waiting for Jiseok's driver after a morning meeting, when she heard her name. She turned to find a woman, elegant 40s, with Jiseok's bone structure and his precise, unreadable eyes. Looking at her with an expression that was not quite hostile but was absolutely a test. "You're the Ghanaian woman," the woman said. Not unkindly. Assessingly. "I'm a Ghanaian woman," Abena replied. "There are many of us." Something flickered in Ji Hyun's expression. "I'm Jiseok's aunt. And I need to tell you something about why you were really chosen for this contract." Abena went still. She listened. And as Ji Hyun spoke, the floor rearranged itself beneath her feet. The contract wasn't just about Director Choi's gala. It was about Jiseok's position within the syndicate. There had been pressure for years for him to marry strategically, to form an alliance through marriage with a rival family. His refusal had weakened his standing. His board, his inner circle, they'd been pushing. The 30-day arrangement had been designed to demonstrate that he was committed to someone, to buy time. And Abena had been specifically chosen not just for her language skills, but because his grandmother had been Ghanaian, and Jiseok had, apparently, made clear in closed meetings that if he ever settled down, she would be someone who connected him to that part of himself. He didn't choose you randomly, Ji-hyun said. He chose the type of woman he'd already decided he wanted. He just didn't tell you that. He didn't tell me that, Abena repeated. No. She smiled, the controlled, bright smile she used when she needed to not fall apart in front of strangers. Thank you for telling me. She got in the car. She held it together through the drive. She made it to her apartment. Then she sat on her kitchen floor and felt the specific pain of realizing that the thing you thought was happening and the thing that was actually happening were not the same thing. And you didn't know which version hurt worse. She called her best friend in Accra, who told her she was being an idiot. She almost agreed. Day 27. She didn't go to the penthouse. She told Min she needed a personal day. Jiseok messaged once, "Are you alright?" She typed and deleted 4 responses and finally sent, "Fine. I'll be there tomorrow." She wasn't fine. She was recalibrating. Because here was the thing. Here was the infuriating, inescapable, deeply inconvenient thing. She understood why he'd done it the way he had. She understood that he'd built so many walls for so long that he didn't know how to want something without constructing an architecture around it first. She understood that the contract had been his way of reaching for something real while keeping it deniable, because Kang Jiseok was a man who had learned that wanting things openly meant losing them. She understood him. And she loved him. And she was furious. Day 28. She showed up. He was waiting in the lobby, which he had never done before, and when he saw her face, he knew that she knew. She watched him go through 5 different expressions in 3 seconds and settle on carefully neutral, which was his version of frightened. "We need to talk," she said. "Yes." They sat in his office. She looked at him across the enormous desk. This man who owned buildings and frightened generals and had a secret shelf of Ghanaian novels. And she said, "Tell me the truth. All of it. Why me? What you actually wanted when you drew up that contract. And don't optimize it. Just say it." A very long silence. And then Kang Jiseok, for the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, did not optimize. He leaned forward, hands clasped, and told her the truth, all of it. That he'd identified her profile months before the contract. That he'd built the arrangement because he wanted to know her but didn't know how to just want someone without it being structured. That somewhere around day 7 he'd realized the structure was irrelevant. That he'd been terrified since day 22 because he'd had things he loved before and the world had a way of taking them. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like I'd manufactured your feelings," he said. "And the thought of doing that to you," he stopped. "You deserved to choose. I just didn't know how to let you choose without losing you." Abena looked at him for a long time. "You're a disaster," she said. "Yes. You commissioned a 30-day girlfriend and caught feelings and panicked." "That's accurate. You're lucky you're incredibly handsome and make excellent coffee." Something cracked open in his face. She stood up. Walked around the desk. He turned his chair to face her, and she stood in front of him and held his face in her hands the same way he'd held hers on day 22. "I'm angry," she said clearly. "And we're going to talk about this properly. All of it. For a long time." "Okay," he said. He meant it. "But I'm also," she exhaled, "I'm not leaving." His eyes closed briefly. The relief that moved across his face was enormous and unguarded and completely undone. He reached up and covered her hands with his. Day 29 dawned soft and golden. They ordered breakfast in, her pepper sauce on everything, his perfect coffee, and sat on his penthouse floor with Seoul waking up below them, her head against his shoulder, his chin on her hair, and the 30-day clock ticking down to 1. Tomorrow was day 30. Tomorrow, according to the contract, she received her 60 million won and went home. They didn't talk about it. They just held on. And then, at 11:47 p.m. on the night of day 29, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. A voice she didn't recognize, low and deliberately calm. "Miss Asante. We know about your arrangement with Kang Jiseok. We know everything. And we need you to understand what happens to the people he gets close to." A pause. Walk away tomorrow. Walk away and don't look back. Or we'll make sure you can't walk away at all. The line went dead. Abena stood in Jiseok's kitchen, heart hammering, phone in her hand. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, reading her face the way he'd learned to read it, precisely, completely, seeing everything. What happened? He said. Not a question. She looked at him. At this impossible, complicated, infuriating, extraordinary man who had found her through a contract and kept her through something that had no word for it. She thought about what to say. She opened her mouth. And that's where we're going to stop. Part 1 ends here. Does she tell him? Does she run? And what does Kang Jiseok do when he finds out that someone threatened the woman he loves? Because make no mistake, this man will burn down the world. Part 2 is coming. And it is going to destroy you in the best possible way. If you made it this far, drop in the comments, Team Abena or Team Jiseok. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you doing? This story is just getting started. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you in part 2.